Thank you all for coming. Thank you for waiting a moment or two. I'll let a few people log in. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about demonstrating progress to gain momentum in your OT security program. I am Rick Kahn. I will introduce myself in a slide or two here, and I'm with Verve Industrial. Today we are talking about the second in a three-part series of building a storyline in general, from either getting started or getting unstuck, into then demonstrating that we're making progress and how that continues to feed upon itself and evolve the program. And then the third webinar in the series, which will give you some links and information for near the end, would be how to take this setup in the system that we advocate and use it for proactively remediating and reducing risk on a continual basis as well. So as you can see on the agenda there, I'm going to run through a little bit of an introduction of myself and the company, just so for those of you who may not know who we are and what we do. I will do a brief, like one slide recap of the initial webinar. Again, this is intended to build upon each other. That was delivered by my colleague, Mr. John Livingston. And then today we're going to get into the meat of our discussion, demonstrating progress. And it is a cycle. And so at different times I will have this order reversed, because it's a, it depends where you're starting and where you're finishing, but they're all tied together in a continuous loop. But we will talk a little bit about reporting, which is, of course, demonstration. If we can pull data up and show it to people, we're doing something right. But the underlying components of what do we do to get data into that report? And that's the first part there, automated data collection. We'll talk a little bit about some recommendations and some pitfalls, most notably the term automated in there. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about providing context to the asset and the information, because the question of progress isn't simply, do I have a big number today and a smaller number tomorrow? The question is, am I addressing the right numbers? Because in OT, we'll never get to zero, and it will continually evolve. And so understanding when and where we should apply our scarce resources to have the biggest impact is really the most demonstrable and valuable measure of progress. And of course, how that leads to remediation, because that's really what we're trying to do. We won't dig into remediation a whole lot today. We will touch upon it, maybe give a couple of case studies, but that is, again, the primary focus of the following webinar, which we will again share with you later. At the end, we will ask or offer any questions. You can, of course, ask throughout in the chat or the QA question channel on the side of this Zoom meeting, and we'll share what the next webinar is. So thank you all for coming. Let's go ahead and get started. So by way of introduction, my name is Rick Kahn. I am the VP of Solutions for Verve. What that means is I get to help our clients globally, no matter what size, shape, or disbursement across geographies or industries, et cetera, to try and short circuit the sometimes laborious, long, slow, painful maturation process into a sustainable and scalable security program. I do that by leveraging, as you can see there, the 20 plus years I've been in the ICS space, exclusively helping to build and design and understand programs. I have worked for some very large and some global OEMs in the past, which has afforded me the opportunity to see very large and complex environments and very small and everything in between, from, Saudi Aramco shortly after Shamoon and their knee-jerk reaction towards, unplugging internet for everybody, to, smaller mom and pop pulp and paper mills and utilities that need to be a little more creative with their scarce resources as well. The good news is that we're all in the same boat. We all have the same challenges, scarce resources, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit about that. So we can definitely learn from one another. And hopefully today we'll bring some examples of what many of your peers are already doing in this space. As a company, Verve Industrial, just as a background, we've actually been in OT for a full 30 years now. We started in 1993. And in the first 15 years, we primarily just did automation engineering, DCS programming, PLC upgrades. So we certainly have a long history of understanding the environment we're playing in, the ramifications of those environments, and of course, the myriad challenges that those sorts of legacy and mixed environments potentially present. About 15 years ago, we got pulled into compliance, which has now led to a more rigorous security standard, primarily by power clients in North America for NERC-CIP. But again, today we are, as an organization, probably helping manage about 150,000 endpoints in about 1,100 different operational facilities in 85 countries around the world in multiple industry verticals. So certainly a proven technology and a proven methodology. And what we're starting to see is that we're extracting very significant wins for our clients, and I hope to share some of those with you today. So as a recap, what went before, as I mentioned, my colleague John Livingston gave a webinar, and I believe the title was How to Get Unstuck. A lot of people start on an initiative. It may be well-intentioned. It may be seemingly the lowest hanging fruit or the largest glaring gap. But these are all built upon the landscape in which we're trying to work, right? And so it's probably important to have a quick look at why this is a challenge. And we like to use the acronym AIR RAID. And as you can see in there, the air raid spells out different sources of pressure on most OT organizations to do something, do more of something, be able to demonstrate it, be able to show value. And the A in air raid is attack. So we don't like to sell on FUD and fear and uncertainty, but the pace of OT and critical level risks and OT specific attacks or vulnerabilities and exploits continues to grow. We can't pretend that it's security by obscurity is still okay because somebody doesn't know what a control system is or that there's a power plant sitting out here in a rural area. We are now very much in the crosshairs of emerging, nation states and even inadvertent, kids playing around buying stuff for free on the dark web. IT is taking more and more responsibility and stepping into this vast, sometimes unknown and uncharted environment on the other side of the firewall, which is a good and a bad thing. They certainly have a deep experience in IT and security, but they have a very, very often a very limited view of OT. And to be honest, this isn't IT. We cannot do scan-based approaches. We cannot make everything Windows 11. We cannot patch on Tuesdays. And so while there's a set of resources and a skill set we want to tap into, we need to make sure that we temper that into OT safe sort of approaches. Of course, regulation is on the rise. Multiple industries continue to get pulled into different types of regulation. Well, regulation isn't necessarily strict security per se. It certainly starts to apply into OT environments, practices we haven't typically done or that we're not necessarily built for. Resource constraints, huge issue. I'm at a conference here this week, and everybody everywhere is starving for people. And so there's lots of talk about, do you build your own? Do you train your own? Do you build them in-house? How can we, in the meantime, do things with automation and scale as opposed to manual, which is unfortunately how a lot of these actions are currently executed today. Access is a direct follow-on from the lack of resources. So many clients are turning to managed services and outsourced support, whether that's from an OEM or an offshore, bulk set of bodies. How do we secure that and restrict that and make sure we understand who's in our environments and under what circumstances, et cetera? Insurance. And looking through the names of today's attendees, I know a couple that are currently working with us because insurance. Premiums get jacked up and coverages get slashed. And so how do we either stop that or prove that we're worthy? Well, the insurance requirements are, do you have an inventory and understand the vulnerabilities on it, right? So there's a responsibility being placed on OT just to be able to get day-to-day things like insurance and coverage. And then finally, directors, more and more boards of committees and chairmen, et cetera, and C-level, V-level, and board level are wanting to know more about what's happening and what's going on. And so all of these come into an environment that is typically not designed for security and has accumulated lots of debt over time. And so we have challenges. John walked through a little bit of how some of that turned into specific stalled problems. There are segmentation efforts that may be stalled because there's a difference of opinion between IT and OT, or there's different legacy equipment, or how do we actually architect it? Assessments, trying to understand what we have and where we need to go. What do we even have for inventory? And that is the key component, and I'll illustrate that in the next couple of slides, to any sort of success unequivocally throughout the entirety of your program. If you don't have a proper inventory, anything and everything you do after that is already compromised. If I only have half an inventory or 2/3 of what I need to know. Getting buy-in for budget. And that's a large part of what we're driving with today here is how are we showing that we're making a value for the efforts, either in time or dollars or both, towards being more secure and less at risk. And of course, there's a lengthy list of needs. There's no shortage of things to do in an OT environment. The question is, what order do we do them in? And what's going to have the biggest bang for the buck, and what's an investment in the future, et cetera. So John walked through all of those, and if you did want to see, there's a link at the bottom there. That's the master page for all of our events. Top left corner is the webinar series. It shows today's, it shows the date for the next one, but also gives you a hyperlink to John. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, definitely go have a look. And the cautionary tale at the slide, the last bullet there before the hyperlink. Today we're hoping to focus on, provide focus to what we're trying to do, what's most important, create context into what we're looking at, because single sources of data or raw data is just noise. And we want to learn from others' mistakes. We're not going to be perfect. We're never going to get a list of vulnerabilities or patches down to zero. And so let's not try to boil the ocean, but let's try to see what is the most important. That's what we're going to dig through today. So, what are some of the challenges to demonstrating progress? Why is this the subject of an entire hour-long webinar? Well, I challenge you to tell me, if you were to go tell your boss, how are we doing? What would you say? We've got vulnerabilities down by 10%, by 50%, from 10,000 to 200. I don't think so, because vulnerabilities are simply a raw list, and not everything necessarily applies to your environment. We'll see a little bit more about why that is. And it's also only a single indicator. There are lots of nuances in vulnerabilities, like attack vector. If it's a physical attack vector and you are completely locked up, or your substation's on the side of a mountain, maybe that's not an issue. Similarly with devices in a segmented network, network-based attack vectors have to go through multiple layers, and so maybe it's not as critical as a raw score as determined by researchers in a lab with no context of your environment. Same goes for patching. Not all patches can always be applied. And so we could say that we went from 800 down to 700 and high five ourselves, but people would say, why still 700? Well, if 400 or 500 of them aren't applicable or can't be done, that's actually a pretty good reduction. But again, without context, we don't know if we're actually moving the needle or if we're not. Technical exceptions, there are going to be gaps you just cannot uncover or fix until you have a capital upgrade to older legacy equipment. And while those should be considered as part of your risk, maybe they shouldn't be on the part that needs to be fixed without a different movement. I mean, immediate risk would be things like removing dormant users and patching systems if you can, but if you had to upgrade equipment to be able to support modern technology, that's a different measurement. And then what about when we go to external measures of risk, like third-party tools that create backups and restoration points for you, or antivirus or whitelisting, right? So, and here's the real big challenge. If you're going to be looking at data from multiple tools or multiple perspectives, you now have to navigate multiple indicators and somehow stitch them together. And secondly, if you then do that times multiple sites, you get sort of an exponential multiplication of complexity to try and pull this together. So it's not impossible. It's just we want to make sure we frame the challenge to begin with. So what do we recommend to solve that? Well, the resolution is, as I said, a cycle. Now, arguably, the root is down here in the automated data collection, but it is part of the overall recurring cycle of knowledge. So what we want to do is we want to get data, and this is where I said your inventory is really, really important. And I'll illustrate why it's so important in 2 more slides here. But your inventory is important. It's important that we not only get everything that we can about the devices we see, but that we get to see as many devices as we humanly possibly have. There are other ways to get inventory. We have had client then pretend there's multiple ways to get inventory. Let me start that way. We could listen to traffic, which is not bad, but always stalls at about 60 to 70% of your inventory, because you can't simply listen in every single corridor or every single subnet of devices to be able to get information. Secondly, when you're listening on the wire, you're hearing command and control data. You're not necessarily hearing hardware and firmware and serial number, or dormant users or installed software that's not activated but has all sorts of risks to it. So we wholly advocate that you go to the source, to the endpoint. We recently had a client come to us and say, could you build an inventory by taking multiple data sources, secondary data sources, stitching them together and deduplicating where you've got, double entries, and give us an inventory that way? You probably could. I think that's very, very error prone. I think it's a lot of extra work, and you're still not going to the source. So we highly advocate that you go to the source and that you automate that data collection, because once we have that, we have as much data as possible about the source devices as possible. We can then start to apply context. And this is going to weave through lots of the things we talked about today. Context is key. I walked into a plant manager's office one day and he said, you're here to do an assessment, and you're going to tell me that I don't patch and I don't change passwords. How does that help me? That's a great question. He already knew what 2 of his biggest issues were, but being able to get down to something he could probably do about that, or that was important for him to do about, was what we were really trying to help him with. And that's where the analysis comes in. So once we get the data, we can apply context, and you'll see what I mean by context in the next 2 slides, how we recommend you build context. That then allows you to do analysis. And that's where we turn raw data to empirical information. We have a client that the other day turned on a single site, 23,900 vulnerabilities. There's no way that you're ever going to get that 23,000 to 0. And there's no way you should recommend to start at the top of that list. And so without some sort of context to that single indicator of risk, we're guessing. We're hoping to have an effect, and we really need to dig in to be able to be effective. Analysis should lead to OT safe remediation plans. And when I say OT safe remediation plans, notice I don't say patching. We do try to patch, but there's also things we can do reactively, which I'll give you some examples in a bit here, as well as proactively that help us to minimize the attack surface, minimize the impact, but maybe stop short of a traditional IT approach of making everything Windows 11 and patching on Tuesdays. That's what I call Plan B, C, and D. And I'm actually going to show you a little bit about what that looks like on the next slide. And that is exactly what we're leading to is if I can't patch, but I can go to stage deployment in cascading deployments. What I mean by this is I want to do something. I can't put it in the quote unquote lab because nobody really has a lab with one of everything they have in the field just by nature of the way they've grown and acquisition and legacy over time. So am I able within the operating environment to pick samples that could be a field lab? So a redundant domain controller that's running the same Windows version as my critical HMIs. That's a pretty safe place to test a patch or a registry edit or something like that before you go into production. And again, that is 100% predicated on how much do I know about my assets? Okay, so what does it look like? Well, to borrow from the industry itself, there's a working group in the ISA 99, which is also now co-branded as IEC 62443. They're called the Patching Support Group or Support Group, the Patching Work Group. And they built what's called the Patch Urgency Tree. And effectively what they were trying to do was this is what we typically do either formally or informally whenever something comes out and we get alerted to a new vulnerability or risk or patch. And that's in the center here, identify a vulnerability and available patch. And the very first thing we typically ask ourselves is, does it affect the industrial control system? Does it affect our operations? The answer is no. We go right back to operations. We may document the patch or not. That's why there's two arrows here. Some people do, some people don't. Depends how formal. But the idea is that if it doesn't affect us, we're not going to immediately worry about it. And this already is a departure in our culture and our thought process, and we see in IT. But it's justified because this is king. Now, if it does affect ICS, the next thing we know is there a workaround available? Well, we need to know a little bit about the risk and the vulnerability to be able to make that answer. And we're starting to lean in towards, well, can I do that workaround on this type of system versus that? So we need to know a little bit more about our target systems. But nonetheless, if there is a workaround, we'll schedule it for some other day and we'll go back to work. But if we do think that there's not a workaround and it does affect us, now we need to go deeper to figure out what exactly are we up against. Now, in the past, many people have simply said, well, I'll patch it if the vendor approves it, and if not, then I won't. But that's living with a significant risk potentially without actually digging in. But if you did want to be able to point to your boss that we are doing the right things at the right pace, i.e. demonstrate risk or demonstrate progress, then we probably need to do this type of analysis. And this type of analysis requires this type of input. Vulnerability footprint, what's its impact? What exposure do I have as an owner and operator? How many of those do I have and where are they? Where are they deployed? And how simple is the attack or the protection? As well as what are the impacts to business needs and operations? Well, the only way to do that is to build what we call a three-dimensional or a 360-degree view of the asset. And so I will show you how we think that cascades. And you'll see here why it is so vitally important to get the inventory correct. If you start with the asset details, I want to get as many information touch points as possible on all my Windows devices, my Linux, my Unix, my OS, as well as my network and communication gear, as well as my, 30 to 60% of my actual control equipment, PLCs, relays, controllers, VFDs, etc. I have a very solid starting point upon which we then want to bring what I call tribal knowledge or metadata. Now, what we mean by that is everything that's in the operator's head about that asset that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get from the asset or on the wire. This is things like the asset's impact to operations. Now, it's pretty straightforward. If it's a safety system, it sounds like it's pretty impactful. But there are also other components. We once did an assessment and found a client who had a lab information management system at a refinery that fed all sorts of data to market pricing, to blending rates, to tank storage, et cetera. That was a single point of failure, had no backup, didn't even have redundant drives, et cetera, et cetera. So there are impacts to assets. There are physical locations, logical locations of those assets. There are contact information for people that you may want to pull in the case of an emergency. This is all of the tribal knowledge over and above the technical data. And so we're giving you a list of assets and starting to tell you, well, what about those assets is important to this particular facility? And it may even change within an organization, facility by facility. The next thing we want to do is to now map all of our own known vulnerabilities, patches, and exploits onto this subset of assets. So again, you see how important it is to get this right. If I'm going to the board or the CISO and saying, look, here's my list of vulnerabilities, and I filtered it to critical vulnerabilities on, critical systems, well, we're doing pretty good. But if I'm not sure I have all the systems in scope, I may be underreporting that number. Now, the last thing we want to do is look, if we're building a proper, robust program, we're going to have multiple layers of defense and depth. That includes both network segmentation as well as security controls like backup, whitelisting, system configuration, system hardening, et cetera. We want to measure those as well. And this is how we build what we call that three-dimensional view. Now, the value of that, and this is where we pivot from doing the legwork to get the data into showing, here's what I'm going to focus on, or we as an OT security team will focus on, and here's how we'll measure it, and here's how we'll report it. So this is really getting into demonstrating progress. So if you take these components, and we do this today with our clients, you take all these components, the asset type, its criticality, both divided by what we've collected and what the user says, risk components, those vulnerabilities, exploits, patches, et cetera. You come with an unmitigated score, and then you start to put in additional compensating controls as the backup and recent as whitelisting and lockdown, et cetera. And you end up with an actual or contextual risk score. So this is taking a single component of a vulnerability that some researcher in a lab said is a critical risk, and actually measuring that and either increasing or decreasing that score based on what it is in your environment, where it resides in that environment, and what that asset would do to your operations if it went away. Now, we can empirically calculate a score by adding points for everything we see in here. The higher the score, the more critical your current risk is. So if it is a critical safety system or it has a critical impact over a key component of our production, those get high points. If we then also see that there are critical vulnerabilities on those assets, those get points. If we see that we don't have that configuration of that device lockdown for least privilege and system hardening, gets more points. If the backup or antivirus are not up to date, they get more points, and we end up with a score. Now, as an organization, you can either establish this ahead of time or we can help you with this. The idea would be that if we had a score in the high rank, we would need to act within, let's say, one business day. So if we were in high, we'd have to go within 3 to 5 business days, and medium, maybe we have until the next turnaround, outage week, whatever. The idea is that you as an organization can dictate what the thresholds of behavior and risk tolerance are. And then as devices are calculated, as a new vulnerability comes out, for example, as a backup fails, or as system hardening changes due to a project or a program upgrade, we will see as devices get calculated and dropped into the different categories. And we're always going to want to focus on these ones and then eventually into these ones. And what we'd like to do is show that we don't have any in this category, or we did, but we moved them down to here, we moved this number down, et cetera. We're now doing a progress report card on actual contextual risk, as opposed to trying to get that 23,000 vulnerability list down to 0, again, because it's not plausible and it's not necessarily the best use of your time, at least up front. So contextual risk score, really big deal. It does allow us to actually build categories. We're able to calculate these on the fly, and if we do apply a patch, rerun a backup, the score would update and that device would drop out of the critical category. Now, how do we do that? Again, we make no bones about the fact you got to go to the source. We advocate that you go directly to the endpoint. If I go right to a Schweitzer gateway, I can enumerate it and all of the serially connected backplane in behind it, or the serial connected devices and relays in behind it. If we go to a chassis, Bentley Nevada, Rockwell, what have you, we can get the head end plus all the cards and even the SIP connected backplane. Same with switch gear and pull back the configuration, and all OS based. Now, we pull that first bit of data and we bring it to a centralized environment to aggregate and contextualize, because what Schweitzer puts out is different than Windows and Stratix, et cetera. But we want to get that starting point. Remember that concentric circles I showed a moment ago? This is the asset data collection. Now, once we have the data collection, we put as many tags as we want to capture everything else that the operators want to put in here. Asset criticality, asset location, physical or logical, contact information of the asset, whether it's redundant or not, when it was deployed, you name it. We also, at this point, then bring in the vulnerability, patch, and exploit data, and we do it at this layer here. And this is a key consideration. Some traditional IT approaches, again, not throwing IT under the bus, but making sure we educate the difference, IT typically uses either cloud-based updates or scan-based approaches to vulnerability identification. Well, both of those are problematic in OT. We don't usually like to poke to the cloud. We also don't like to scan PLCs, relays, or switchgear. And so you have a big gap potentially in your vulnerability data if you're not doing it like this, where you're doing it offline and mapping to all components. So you get a much better view. Again, we want to be reporting the real number, not what we think the number is. At this layer, you can also go east and west in the DMZ to host a backup and antivirus and whitelisting tools. And therefore, we've now built the aggregated multi-dimensional or 360-degree view of the asset. And then remember so that takes care of one of the deals up front where instead of having to look into multiple different security tools, we aggregate the data from those tools for you. And then the second is we can aggregate multiple sites into a single reporting. And so that exponential increase in complexity is now removed. We're able to see, for example, when the next version of Bluekeep comes out, exactly how big a deal it will be for us enterprise-wide at this view, which lets us then do what we call think global, act local. At this corporate view, with a wide range of visibility into all of the sites, all of the assets, and all of the risks, we can then employ a very small or lean team of both IT and OT that can help to identify these risks that are fleet-wide quite often and construct a response and share that multiple times. The alternative is you've got 6 different locations. They all get an email saying, hey, here's a new risk. And all 6 react at different speeds with different tool sets and different levels of efficiency. And you're going to get 6 different levels of compliance with that sort of approach. So by doing this think global, act local, not only are we demonstrating real-time live exactly how we are fleet-wide, we're able to proactively help to minimize that and not have to duplicate all these efforts. So when you're demonstrating progress, we're not just demonstrating progress in risk reduction, we're demonstrating progress and efficiency in maintenance and management without having to build an army. So we can prioritize risks, we can build playbooks, we can actually control prioritization, we can then send actions down here if we need it, and it can be very, very precise. Now, people see this action, they get a little bit nervous about Big Brother pushing into OT. Let me give you an example of how this typically works. We had a client, had 6 coal-fired generation facilities. They did want to get rid of Kaspersky as per corporate order, Kaspersky Russian-built antivirus software. And so they were able to look at a global dashboard for software and see that they had 146 copies of that across the 6 locations. They sent a request via the software on the OS-based devices to uninstall the software, but they set a flag saying, don't do anything until someone's standing at the console. And so this small lean team up front here is able to show corporate, we have 146 copies, we're going to go take care of it, just stay tuned. They then notified each of the sites and said, here's your share of those 146. And because they have metadata on those assets, they can show which room, which floor, which rack. Each site was able to dispense an individual in parallel to each other to those precise locations in their physical location. And then they got to the system tray, they saw a flashing light saying, please uninstall. They followed their local change control. They phoned the operator control room. They did their own thing, moved to the next one. All 6 did this in parallel. And we were able to show the CISO that within 2 hours of his request to remove Kaspersky, the entire fleet was free of any of that software. Very much one design, automation where possible, but OT doing the last mile oversight, and then a resulting update lets us show directly to the board just how quick and efficient we were being and how well we were managing our risk. So as we round the corner here, I got a few more slides, and I'm going to get to a couple of sample views as to how this extrapolates into different individual pursuits and demonstrations of risk as well. So a refresh point though, back to my original, like I said, I will sometimes switch these back and forth. The idea is that we want to be able to show risk remediation because that's really what progress is all about. Are we progressing the maturity of our program? Are we progressing against reducing the risk? Are we progressing against hardening and strengthening the environment? To do that, we absolutely have to have context. We cannot just have individual or raw risk without any sort of reference back to the actual device. It is 100% powered by automated data collection. I have a client that I spoke to today at the conference who is manually collecting inventory once a year. They hire a summer intern. And the intern is tasked with taking the existing Excel spreadsheet and walking through all of the different racks and components and cables and cable rooms and verifying anything and everything that's in the spreadsheet versus what they actually find. And then when they're done, they hand it over, they go back to school. That's the most boring internship I think I've ever heard of, but it is what it is. And then throughout the year, they try to maintain through various integrations or logins to different systems like antivirus or WSS, and then use change control to try and keep that up to date. You can imagine how quickly that approach gets out of sync with what reality is in the environment. So we automate the data collection, we feed it into reporting. What does this look like? Okay, let me show you a few examples of what this ends up looking like and what your day could be like in terms of demonstrating progress and or allocating resources, or to John's stalled presentation last time, how you get buy-in. I mean, if we can show how big of an issue this is and how much progress we're making if we just had one more person or one more cycle, and it's backed by evidence, might make world getting budget a lot easier. So the first one we have here is an example of the base inventory. And as you can see here, we're able to split by location and then control function. So we could look simply at safety systems. We could look simply at Active Directory or domain controllers if we had them. We could look at all systems at a particular location. This is where we start to have the value of the power of aggregating all this data to a single view and then letting us pivot explicitly into specific concerns. If your OEM vendor, for example, gave you a note and said, hey, by the way, this version of this model, which we think you have based on our sales records, has this issue. Until further notice, do this, or this. Well, you would immediately be able to grab this and show it to whoever you needed to, both the OT team as well as upwards to corporate and risk management, exactly what it is that you have, and be able to start formulating a plan and then execute against it. We could do it by manufacturer, as I mentioned just now. We could do it by actual device type. We could do it by Purdue model zone. When we get to attack vectors being network-based, well, is anything in layer 2 or 1 something we're really worried about, network-based attack vectors? I mean, probably eventually, but maybe not as concerned as we are if they're in layer 3.5 or 3 of the Purdue model. And then finally, that sort of aggregated risk score, right? So if we want to look at the asset impact and risk, we've got a bunch that are in the high category. We want to start working on those to pull them down and eventually get rid of this red bar. So it's all of the other 3 categories. So that's one way of looking at progress or status from a hardware perspective. We can also look at it from software. One of the things that many people don't realize is very low-hanging fruit and very easy to do is a lot of vulnerabilities and patches are related to things like Office products. And we often find that when people are installing Excel to look at ladder logic in an operational environment, they install the basic Office package. So you're getting Access and PowerPoint. Well, if we could go and get rid of all these different Office components, Visual Studio, etc., we would immediately also remove all the vulnerabilities that are typically mapped against those. We can also watch for software that we don't want to see popping up, like people installing TeamViewer to build a homegrown remote access component, right? So we're able to monitor and manage risk from multiple perspectives if we take the time to get the multiple data points. Moving to vulnerabilities, we have a couple different ways to look at vulnerabilities. This is sort of a preliminary view with a raw count by criticality. We can also look at them by location. We can look at them by a combination of the severity and the attack vector, right? So that critical and network-based critical, that's a pretty big deal. Well, that's a large part of mine, but that 22 is a very small subset still. So that does allow us to sort of narrow down from thousands to a few to at least to initially focus on. And what that typically looks like when we evolve the vulnerability view, we can see that there are multiple ways to assess your vulnerability status, right? So here we're showing criticality of vulnerabilities. Here we're showing the impact. If you know much about vulnerability reports, they talk about the impact. Does it affect the availability of the system, the integrity of the system, or the confidentiality of the system? In OT, obviously, it's all about availability. And one of the categories that is often found is that it would take complete availability of the system away. In other words, a denial of service, bring you to your knees, or maybe even brick it. We could filter on that and focus primarily on those vulnerabilities and take this number down to something much smaller that, again, allows us to demonstrate that we are focusing on the real risk as opposed to the raw list of risk. You can also see here we've got a list of individual assets. Now, in this case, we've got a few that are bad actors and a higher level of concern over here. Those are ones that are pretty interesting, but maybe they have a story behind them. So, for example, one of our clients has a bunch that are up high, and they put extra firewalls and network access control in front of them because they're legacy equipment that they can't simply flip out. but they don't want to live with the risk. So they put other compensating controls in place. And so this dashboard is easy to extract those devices with name tags or segments and exclude them from the view when you're showing the report, or annotate them. The other one is one of our refining clients had exactly this, and the audit team phoned them and said, why do you have 5 or 6 that are kind of getting through the roof? They had made a strategic decision that they were going into outage on the weekend, and those 5 were all going to be retired and the hard drives drilled through with a metal drill bit, and they were going to be recycled. And so they were going to accept the risk for 3 days rather than divert engineers to patching. Those engineers were then able to plan outage and turnaround tasks, and they accepted the risk for the 72 hours that they would be living with it. But again, we're now making informed decisions based on context as opposed to just a raw list of risk. We also have the ability to show release date by attack vector. And again, I've already mentioned the notion of taking network-based attacks, and if they're in zone 2 of the Purdue model, perhaps lowering their criticality. But here's the 2 really cool ones for me. There's just a normal count of vulnerabilities in the system on any given day by criticality. And you can see that we can show trends if we needed to senior management. And you can see that we're sort of averaging around this sort of middle layer here in general. And if that's acceptable to the organization, then we can do that. If we want to drop it down a bit, we may need to add some staff or what have you. But now, again, we're having discussions based on empirical data, not just on noise. And then this one here, we've got 2 axes, which I think is my favorite graph. We're showing the vulnerability severity. So this ranking here of critical, as determined by the National Vulnerability Database, it is deemed to be a critical risk based on the various components of it, or high, medium, or low. And then we, as operators, have also similarly labeled our assets as critical to normal operations versus high impact to operations, medium or low. And the cross-reference of a critical vulnerability on a critical asset is where we can now show a very, very narrow focus to be what I call a cyber sniper and go after this cross-section of information, which is a subset of all of this over here. Now, this particular heat map, as you see, has color coding based on the number of devices that in that environment. And so you could see here as an organization, we may want to focus on this, even though the number is low, it's between 0 and 100. Or we could focus on this big red one, which means we've got 1,200 or 12,000 that are considered high impact assets and a high criticality for vulnerability. Again, we're able to have educated and contextual discussions based on empirical data as opposed to conjecture or single indices of potential risk. Pivoting to the next step, I've got a couple slides left here. A similar view on patching, patch release date, patch severity, but also patch type. As you know, sometimes patches are simply product updates. Sometimes they're bug fixes, etc. But when they actually are a security concern, we want to maybe extract those. Again, the same bad actors that we saw in the vulnerability, no surprise, vulnerabilities usually tied to patches. But down here, we've got a couple of other things to allow us to filter, and again, have contextual discussions around progress or lack thereof. We can actually look at the specific patch, how many assets applicable on, how many CVEs it addresses, and this one is the single biggest bang for our buck. If we figure that patch out, we get rid of 7% of the risk in our environment. Alternatively, we could get pushback from the plant saying, well, until the vendor approves it, I don't want to do it. Fair enough. We can see here that we're also able to build filters, and there's a little toggle switch if this were live as opposed to a screenshot, that I could turn on the Emerson approved patches as of October, and we look at a subset and have a discussion with our Emerson operators and say, look, these are approved, they're available in the system, why aren't they being deployed? And it's hard to argue, again, when there's context in there. We can then show, again, on a progress perspective, what has been applied. And in this case, we have some clients that are looking at the asset name, and it's not in this particular view, but the asset criticality, just like we're talking about. So we could see that our more critical assets are getting more attention. We're seeing that we've got lots of patches installed on some of these assets, and it not always able to, right? Correlation of can you apply the patch because it's a legacy COS versus is it a critical system isn't necessarily there, but we can at least see where we're spending our time and effort by number of patches installed and the patches that were actually done. Oops. Moving to a proactive stance for demonstrating progress or where you want to attack gaps next, we have the ability also with this approach to show very specific system hardening or least privilege components. And so along the bottom here, we have a whole bunch of checks that we want to check. Things like, is the guest account disabled? Is remote desktop set to only administrative class asset, accounts, etc.? all sorts of things that are typical best practice. Let's lock the system down and harden them. As soon as we're on these devices, we're measuring them both for OS based and networking based, and we can start to track how compliant we are or non-compliant, and then again decide which of the non-compliant do we want to tackle first. Do we want to disable the guest account everywhere? Well, since that was a blue key, vantage point, that's probably an important one to do. But maybe the time server, sync settings is something we can save till later. But again, you're having a contextual discussion that allows you to make logical and practical choices as to which order to proceed in. The last angle of potential improvement I want to show is that many organizations are now getting into, what does our life cycle look like? And so it's pretty easy to figure out from an OS that it's Windows 7 or older and no longer has even extended patch support. But it's not so straightforward and much more complex when you get into the control equipment. Well, this type of granular data into inventory allows us to also leverage lifecycle and capital planning, right? Which again, if you're looking, and I said earlier, technical exceptions on one of the slides, we're going to try to do a standard program, but we're going to have outliers. We're going to have, redheaded stepchildren that, don't play nice because they don't support syslog or they're 10 or 12 or 15 years old. Being able to understand exactly how many of them we have by model, by location and OS version, et cetera, allows us to then get in front of maintenance and capital budgets and general upgrades as well. So we've gone from, if you follow that, we've gone from, hey, I don't know what I don't know, or I know that I don't change passwords and I don't patch, to now I can proactively plan which of my systems and by how much I need to do them and which cycle I can do them in, because I'm proactively hardening and I'm able to react as new things come out. We've gone very much from conjecture or hyperbole to proactive, demonstrable, current status and progress against corporate objectives. And you don't have to believe me. If you want, you could go look, and if you're happy, if you'd like, just hit me up and I'll send you a link. One of our power clients was NERC-CIP compliant, which is what the blue measure is. They measured themselves as a NERC-CIP client against NIST CSF, which is a more security standard. And the blue are the scores that they got. You notice they were really high in governance. They had all sorts of executives and managers named to the NERC program. They also were very high in awareness and training. Anywhere in North American Power, you go into a facility and there's posters about sharing passwords and holding the doors open and et cetera. And again, those are more regulatory. They're not necessarily pure security like you see in the protect and detect here. But once they deployed this, endpoint-based approach with contextual data and remediation, they then reset and reanalyze themselves against the NIST standard. And the orange are the improvements they made. You can see in some cases they quadrupled or infinitely increased, but in general, they uniformly improve their security posture across the entirety of a NIST CSF program. And so if you're wanting to demonstrate progress, this is a pretty compelling story. And again, this was told publicly at a ARC conference a couple of years ago by one of our clients. If you want to see it, like I said, don't believe me, listen to somebody who's in your boots and see what you think. So turning to the conclusion and opening the Q&A in a moment, summary is it simply demonstrating progress requires data. It's simple. I mean, if I want to demonstrate something, I need to show you something, but it has to be contextual. Again, if you showed the boss you had 23,000 vulnerabilities today and suddenly you're down to 15,000, that's a cursory view of progress, I guess. But were they the right 8,000 that you knocked off, or there's some still critical components in there that you're not aware of? True measurement actually requires multiple views. Again, asset criticality relative to other controls, where it sits in the network, what's in front of it. Actual risk is what should be measured, right? Filter and subfilter to provide real world scoring. And automation and data update is key. These environments are actually a lot more static than we think they are. When I was at Honeywell in 2009, they spent a lot of money certifying a whitelisting product, because the idea was whitelisting is a set and forget type thing and the OT is untouchable and never changes. The reality is that they do change more than we think, and that's why that particular silver bullet didn't quite live up to its expectation. So we need to be near real time to get away from assumptions and inference. Aggregating multiple sites into a single view is key to enterprise-wide management. Again, there's no sense in sending an email to 6 sites and all 6 sites deciding to do their own thing at their own pace and to their own level of capability. I mean, it is how it's set up today, but if you want to truly get ahead of this and not have to have an army, we wholly and strongly recommend the aggregated and centralized sort of overview. And it does significantly aid or speed remediation. So without giving away too much of the next webinar topic, we do have a client, another client that put up a case study that the traditional method of trying to do this with WSUS and spreadsheets and multiple people on a phone call and different email communications when Bluekeep comes out, they did that before, and then they did this automated centralized sort of view, and they found that they saved 70% of their manual effort per event. And so to put it in context, instead of coming in and telling your entire team of engineers that Monday morning until Friday afternoon they're working on virus reconciliation or threat reconciliation, they all start Monday morning, but they're all back to being engineers by Tuesday midday. It was a 72% decrease in effort. And if you can get your engineers back to work by Tuesday, or you can have that minimal impact, but still demonstrably show exactly where your risk is and why and what you're doing about it, you've very significantly moved the needle in this space. So that's it for me today. There's about 10 minutes left. If there's any questions, I'll pull up the Q&A. Please feel free to put your hand up or say something now. I'll give you a minute here to see if anybody's not too shy and wants to jump on that. In the meantime, there is my email and phone number. Our main website is there, and you saw earlier at the top right corner, if you didn't catch it, if you go to Verve Industrial, top right corner, there's resources, and under that is events. Top of the event page is both this webinar as well as the next one and the recordings of the previous ones. It doesn't look like there's any, let me just go into these. Doesn't look like there's any questions live at the moment. We will be following up with all attendees, thanking you for coming and sending you a link to this recorded webinar if you'd like, as well as a slide deck. And if that's all, I will then go ahead and give everyone 10 minutes back. I do appreciate the time you spend. I know how busy everybody is, and time is a very precious resource. So appreciate you sharing some of it with me today. I hope it was worth your while. And feel free, hit me up if you want to talk about any of this any deeper. Thank you all. Have a great day.